In 2022, 4 European bison were released into a section of woodland in Kent, England, for the first time in thousands of years. Not 5,000, not 10, thousands. And what those 4 animals did to that forest inside of 12 months changed the way scientists understand how land heals. This is not a story about conservation charity. This is a story about bark, mud, and dead wood, and how 4 large animals rewrote the rules of an entire ecosystem without anyone telling them to. Let us go back to the beginning, because that beginning matters. Blean Woods in Kent had a problem that most people driving past it would never have noticed. It looked like a forest. Tall trees, green canopy, the usual. But underneath that canopy, the ground was nearly bare. Dense shade had choked off the lower layers, wild flowers were gone. Beetles that depend on deadwood were disappearing. The birds that feed on those beetles were thinning out too. Ecologists working with Rewilding Britain and the Kent Wildlife Trust called it a closed canopy problem. The forest had become a kind of biological ceiling with almost nothing living beneath it. They had tried management, chainsaw work, manual clearing, controlled burns in other parts of Europe. But those approaches are expensive, they require constant repetition, and they only work where you put the labor. What they needed was something that would do the work continuously, intelligently, and for free. They needed an engineer. The European bison, Bison bonasus, is the heaviest land animal native to Europe. Adult bulls can reach 900 kilograms. They were hunted to extinction in the wild by 1927. A captive population survived, and through one of the most careful breeding programs in conservation history, their numbers have slowly recovered. Today there are roughly 7,000 in managed populations across Europe, mostly in Poland and Romania. But Blean Woods in 2022 marked something historic. It was the first time bison had been released in Britain. Not reintroduced to Scotland or Wales, not trialed in a zoo enclosure, released into a working piece of ancient woodland with room to roam and a specific ecological purpose. The team released 1 bull and 3 females. One of the females was pregnant. Here is what nobody fully predicted. Bison are what ecologists call a keystone species and a physical ecosystem engineer, but those terms make the process sound clean. It is not clean. It is loud, slow, and covered in bark. Bison strip the bark from trees. They do it to manage the insects in their fur, to regulate their skin temperature, and sometimes, based on current research, simply because certain trees have compounds they need. When they strip bark from a pine or a willow, they wound the tree. Sometimes the tree dies. And here is where it gets strange for anyone who is taught that dead trees are a problem. Dead trees standing upright, what scientists call snags, are some of the most biodiverse structures in any forest ecosystem. Beetles colonize the soft inner wood. Woodpeckers follow the beetles. Bats nest in the cavities the woodpeckers leave behind. Mosses and lichens cover the outer surface, holding moisture that seeds need to germinate. One dead tree, left standing, can support hundreds of species over decades. The bison were not destroying the forest. They were building a different kind of forest. One with gaps, with light, with rot, with the specific texture that thousands of species had evolved alongside over millions of years. Within the first year, ecologists documented changes they did not expect to see for a decade. If a story like this gives you hope, comment the word hope so we know you're watching. Rare bees returned to sections of the wood where the bison had opened the canopy. Not a few species. 18 species of bee recorded in the impacted zones within 12 months. Several of them had not been recorded in that area for years. The light reaching the forest floor was triggering dormant seed banks, seeds that had been sitting in the soil waiting for exactly this kind of disturbance. Violets, foxgloves, and wild grasses began reclaiming ground that had been bare shade for decades. But the bison were doing something else too, something that generated as much scientific interest as the bark stripping. They wallow. A bison wallow is a depression in the ground where animals roll and kick and grind the earth down to bare mineral soil. It looks like a mess. It is actually a pond waiting to happen. Shallow depressions filled by rain become seasonal pools. Seasonal pools are the single most important freshwater habitat in temperate woodland for amphibians. Great crested newts, one of Europe's most protected species, have been documented moving toward bison wallow pools within months of their formation. Dragonflies, colonize them. Rare aquatic beetles that depend on ephemeral water that appears and disappears with the seasons, find exactly what they need in the irregular, unpredictable chemistry of a wallow pool. None of this was engineered by the ecologists. The bison did it. The bison have always done it. They did it across Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before humans removed them from the equation, and the moment the bison returned, the land remembered what to do with them. That is the part that should make you pause. We spent decades trying to restore individual species, individual habitats, individual hectares, and those efforts matter. But what the Bleen experiment is demonstrating is something larger. When you return a process, not just a species, but an entire behavioral process, an animal that strips and wallows and grazes and moves across a landscape, the system does not slowly recover. It snaps. Parts of it come back fast, faster than models predicted, because the soil and the seed bank and the dormant insect populations were not dead. They were waiting. The calf born in Bleen became the first wild-born bison in Britain in thousands of years. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a bison calf standing in an English wood, learning to strip bark from trees the way its species has always stripped bark, in a forest that was already beginning to sound different. Birdsong surveys conducted in the impact zone showed measurable increases in species diversity within the study area. The specific species returning were insectivorous birds that eat beetles and larvae from dead wood, birds whose decline across Britain has been documented and worried over for 30 years. They came back because the food came back. And the food came back because the bison opened the ceiling. Here is what this tells us, and why it matters beyond one forest in Kent. Britain has lost more of its native biodiversity than almost any other country in Europe. The numbers are stark. Surveys consistently place the UK among the most nature-depleted nations on the planet. That is not a political statement. That is ecological measurement. And it means that the experiments Britain runs on restoration are experiments running from a very deep deficit. Bleen is not a solution to a national crisis. 4 bison in 405 hectares is not going to reverse a century of land use change. The scientists running the project are the first to say so, but what it is proof. Proof that the processes still work. Proof that given even a small window, even a contained piece of land with a handful of large animals, the response can be faster and more complex than pessimists expected. The team is already talking about what comes next. More land, more animals. The possibility of connecting Bleen to other restored areas, building something closer to a corridor, a route through which species can move and processes can spread. This is how it begins, not with a grand gesture, with 4 animals, a piece of bark, and a forest that had been waiting in silence for something to come back and wake it up. What happened in Bleen is a template, not a miracle. The miracle framing is comforting, but it lets us off the hook, because miracles do not require decisions. Templates do. Templates mean that someone, somewhere, looked at a dying forest and said, return the process, get out of the way, and watch what the land already knows how to do. In the decades ahead, more forests will face the same silence that Bleen had. More grasslands, more wetlands, more coastlines are going to need the same question asked of them. What was here before we simplified it, and can we bring even a piece of that back? The answer, in at least one wood in Kent, is yes. And the data was undeniable. If you believe nature still has a chance, subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming.